Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bryan. I'm joined with my co-host, Jim Reske, and we have a special guest with us tonight, Pastor Jim, who is an old friend of mine that we go way back, and the three of us are going to have a discussion on the first half of the book of Job, Job's chapter 1 through 31. The very first verse is, "In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job." And we're going to talk about him tonight. But before we get into that, let's introduce, for our audience sake, Pastor Jim. Pastor Jim, introduce yourself and tell us how it came to be that you joined us on this podcast.
My name is Jim Folk. I'm a pastor in Cary, North Carolina, just outside of Raleigh. And Greg and I have known each other for a long time. I think the first time we met was probably spring of 1996, I want to say, somewhere around there.
That sounds about right.
And I think Greg and I first met at maybe service at a church plant in Wadsworth, Ohio. I was right out of college and was a high school math teacher for a couple of years. And I had met Greg, and he said, "Hey, I need a roommate." Or don't you want to be roommates or something like that? I don't know. I forget how it came up, but we got to know each other a little bit. And then we were roommates for about a little over a year. And and then he decided to do the Navigators thing. So that was pretty cool. Because I can remember specifically, Greg, the one conversation you told me, you said, "This is all about discipling students. And this is always what I've wanted to do. Or this is always what I've dreamed of doing," or something to that effect. So that was pretty cool to kind of be there at that God moment of your life when you realize that was kind of like your new calling, that God was calling you to work with students and meet one-on-one, and so that was pretty neat.
Yeah, those were the days, man. You and I were both young and single. I think we're in our mid-20s, or I'm a little older than you, but we used to, we had spent had a lot of good times together, hanging out and doing fun stuff, and then living together was fun too. Although I'm going to tell a story on you, Jim, Pastor Jim.
I bet I know which one it is.
I think you do. Yeah. So the funny thing is, whenever I ate, we lived together, so whenever I would eat a meal, I would clean my dish right away, and then I put it back in the cupboard. And then Jim, on the other hand, liked to let his dishes pile up through the week. And so I'll never forget, one Friday night or Saturday morning or something like that, Jim turns to me, he goes, "Hey, Greg, how about we do the dishes?" And I started laughing. I'm like, none of those dishes are mine. Those are all your dishes, and you want we to do the dishes. I just thought that was just so funny. But it also says a lot about Jim, because he is a great friend, and we did.
And I still ask my kids to do that. Why don't we do the dishes?
It's a great opportunity to serve.
Right. So,
and Greg was very efficient as a bachelor, because he only used one plate and one cup per day. I can remember he would have a bagel in the morning with a Coca-Cola, and that was about it. And he would use the same glass, and he would leave the glass on the counter so he could use that, later on in the evening. So, yeah. I still
actually have that habit. I have one glass that I use. My wife could show you, I could, go get it. I do, as far as the glass goes. Yeah. I gave up the Coke in the morning, though.
Oh, okay.
Finally.
Okay. Yeah.
But
I can remember there were a lot of mornings where it was like a bagel and a Coke was breakfast, and But one funny thing I remember is now this is going back a few years, but I remember Greg was usually, especially on the weekends, since I was a school teacher. So if I could sleep in on the weekends, I would. But Greg was usually up before me on the weekends, and so he would come in the room, and sometimes he would turn on the light. And so Greg was always joking around and trying to think of, different ways just to keep things fun, humorous, and whatnot. And so that was around the time I think Frank Peretti had written the books, This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness. And so when I would be, kind of half awake on a Saturday morning or whatnot, the room was still dark. Greg would lean in the doorway and he'd say, "This Present Darkness," and then he'd flick the light switch, and the light would come on, and he'd say, "Piercing the Darkness." And then we'd joke about, "Hey, it's time to get up," or, what are you going to do today? So that was just a fun little story about when we were roommates. So
Greg, that sounds like your kind of humor.
Man,
yeah.
I'm so glad I
Play on
grew
words.
up. I'm so glad I grew up.
We both got a kick out of it at the time. That was kind of fun.
We did. Well,
around. Sorry to Frank Peretti for for the reference there, but
one of the things I'm notorious for is telling jokes and I'm the one who laughs. So if the joke makes me laugh, then I think then it's the best joke, So remember Jim Reske, remember when we first started the podcast, I tried to do that the joke part.
Yeah,
remember?
Joke of the day or dad jokes or some tagline for it.
Yeah, sticky jokes or something
Sticky
like that.
jokes. Yes, we should bring that segment back.
Yeah, I tried to have an institutional segment on our podcast where we would share jokes every time, but then life happened and
Well, I do have one for you since I was a former math teacher.
Okay.
Where does a math teacher go for vacation?
Where?
Times Square.
Oh, Times Square. Okay. Well, my math joke is 5 out of every 4 people have problems with fractions.
That's right. That's right.
Or there's 3 types of math people. There's those who are good at math and those who aren't.
That's right. 3 types.
There's 3 types, but all righty. Well, let's dive into the book of Job. So I'm going to start with Jim Reske. You're coming up to the plate to teach this. What are some of the big observations you're making so far in your research?
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So just in terms of structure, at our Bible study when we're teaching, we're going to be dividing this into 2 parts. So I'm going to be taking Job 1 through 31, and then a colleague of ours is going to take the rest of it. So kind of divides the book up. It's not quite in half, but it kind of divides it up thematically into 2 different sections. So there's a lot of Job that's understood in terms of how as a whole. So some of what I'll be doing is setting up some of these kind of questions and then resolving them. Although I do think one thing I've observed is that in Job, the narrator, the writer, is really good about setting up tensions. But as we all know, the main tension of the book, why is God allowing suffering, is unresolved to the very end. So kind of not to steal the thunder, but it's one of the big questions of the book. But I was actually hoping maybe with 2 seminarians on the call, one of you could give a very brief overview for our audience. Someone's never read Job before and says, "Job? I thought it was Job." Like, what's that book about? It's J-O-B. It looks like job in English, but what's that about? Maybe he gets as our guest, Pastor Jim. I can put you on the spot if you are going to sum up Job and the whole book in a few sentences for the number who's never read it before. How'd you summarize it? Oh, wait, and Pastor Jim, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, the book of Job is basically deals with the question of suffering.
Uh-oh. His internet is suffering.
Yes.
And he's probably going to have to call back in or something.
Yeah, probably.
So he was saying that the book of Job is about suffering. We'll see if he... Oh, there. Are you back?
There we go. I'm back. Yes.
All right. We'll start over again.
Your internet was suffering.
Okay.
So you were saying,
I was saying basically Job has to do with the question of suffering. There's a man in the man who the book is about, Job, is he's referred to as a righteous man before God. And in the beginning of the book, God and Satan basically have an agreement, uh, for lack of a better word, to say let's have an experiment here. And Satan is allowed to test Job in various ways, to where he takes away Job's family, he takes away Job's livelihood, he afflicts Job with physical suffering. And so let's see if Job really wants to worship God or not. Let's see if
Right.
Job really stays true to God. And God says, okay, you can test Job, but you can't take his life. So then the middle of the section of the book is Job's friend's response to his suffering, and also Job's own response, processing his suffering. And then there's a fourth friend that comes along, in addition to the first three, who enters the dialogue. And then the end of the book of Job is Job finally getting his hearing with God, his court date with God, if you will, and then God answering Job at the end. And so there's that's the basic format of it.
but then he
Yes,
gets everything back. He gets,
And well, that's the spoiler alert, Greg. If you haven't read
don't
the
go
book of
see the
Job.
movie.
Yeah, yeah. So Job is restored in terms of his possessions, in terms of he has children again, and whatnot. And but the question is, how does Job process what God tells him at the end?
Yeah, and
That's
so,
right.
and I would say, it's one of the most unique books in the Bible because it's set in this place called Uz, which I'm pretty sure we don't even exactly know where it is, or maybe Jim, you found out there. It's far away from Israel, so in some senses, it doesn't make sense that it's in the Bible because it doesn't really have anything to do with Israel. And then all the characters are non-Israelites, and there's no clear historical setting of the book. Which, unless now, I could be wrong. Jim, did you find out anything different, or is
That's
that
one of the first. It's one of the things I try to do, Greg, as we know, is we have some really, really bright people in our study, and they love to ask really piercing questions. And so, Jim, it keeps us on our toes. We really need to kind of be ready for that. And so we look up kind of Bible difficulties and the kind of, what are the obvious questions you should be ready for? And one of the first ones was this: is Job really a historical figure or a fictional character? It's a nice story. You actually, as you mentioned, it starts off talking about Job and how blameless he is. And then you go to this background conversation in heaven between God and Satan talking about Job. And then you have all these long poetic discourses where, Job's friends say something and Job replies, all very eloquent. And the whole thing is, well, is it someone just wrote this later as a nice story? Or are they real people? The commentators I read were, Christian commentators, but basically came down and said, no, it's really, you could argue that and look at it both ways, but there are references to Job as an individual, like in the book of Ezekiel. Job is referenced along with Noah and Daniel and Job, the three of them as individuals, as real people. So the same way Noah and Daniel were real individuals, the Bible in Ezekiel refer to Job as a real character as well. And then Job comes up also in the book of James in the New Testament. James references Job's perseverance. So in terms of the biblical narrative, the biblical evidence, it is referencing Job as a real character. But I think you're right, Greg, in terms of like exactly when did it take place and exactly when was it written? Lots of uncertainty about that. I think a lot of people think, and I've thought for years, it's the oldest book in the Bible. I've heard that many, many times. People say this was written before anything, the most ancient book, and other people say no, it was written later. Some of the language looks like it was more recent, but I don't think people really know. So I do think it's really well loved. I mean, everybody seems to love the book of Job. I bet you, Pastor Jim, when you were preaching on this, people just ate it up and just love talking about people. It was my father's favorite book of the Bible. People love Job, love talking about it. It really connects with people, maybe because it's the theme of suffering, which is just universal, right? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think people really identify with Job as an individual.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was at a licensing meeting for someone in the Evangelical Free Church, and in your licensing document, you have to give scripture references for, you're stating your personal theology as it relates to the Free Church statement of faith and all that. And the person was writing about, the difficulty of suffering or following Christ, and she just put parentheses the book of Job. And I thought, well, yeah, that certainly identifies with it. You could go many places in the book of Job and just see examples of him trying to process his own suffering. And so that just, I just give that example because that exemplifies how people just identify that one biblical character. They identify with that one biblical character, I think, much more than they might say a Daniel or a King David or Deborah from the book of Judges. People just gravitate, I think, in their mind and in their experience to, is this a trial that I'm going through, like something similar that Job went through?
Yeah, Job's kind of the central question of why am I suffering? It's just universal. Everyone kind of thinks about that, Greg.
Yeah. So I have a comment and then a question. My comment is, how cool is it that it's part of the wisdom literature?
Right.
It's part of, it kind of goes along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And so the idea is it's supposed to give us wisdom, although it doesn't answer the question about suffering, because I think it still doesn't answer the question. But then the question I have, Jim, is, did you do any research yet on the authorship of it?
No. Did you have any thoughts on that, or did you? Or
I don't think anybody knows. I don't think we know.
It's definitely not in the first person, right?
Which is it's an amazing piece of literature to be anonymous.
It is. Well, so that's part of the literary aspects of it. I thought, and I'm still learning about it, but some of that was really kind of very interesting to me. They say the use of language here is really higher order language. There are words used in Job that are not used anywhere else in Scripture. So you're sometimes using, you said this to me before, Greg. I learned this from you, that the Hebrew language doesn't have that many characters, doesn't have that many words, right? Compared to English, isn't that true?
Right. Yes.
And so oftentimes in the books of the Bible, you understand what you're saying in the book of Daniel, for example, because that same word will be used in Ezekiel and so on. All through the Bible, you can understand Scripture through Scripture. But there's so much in Job that's not written that way. That's higher order. It's like a literary masterpiece. And then the one thing I thought when I was looking at that part of it, I was listening to a lecture, and I got a bunch of different sources. One of whom, we always try to give the sources, but for full attribution, listen to a Tim Keller sermon on Job, and I was listening to some work from the Bible Project. But they were pointing out that the literary tension, the way the writer sets it up, is so great, because if you didn't have those first couple chapters where they have that conversation between God and Satan, and you just went into Job's suffering and the friends' responses, you would hear the friends say, well, Job, you must have done something wrong to deserve this suffering. And you kind of will play into that. But the writer sets it up front by saying, God says this servant is blameless. So the first part of it is he's holy and righteous. In fact, he's so holy and righteous that he offers sacrifices for his children. He's such a great guy. And then God and Satan talking about him, and God offers to Satan, have you seen my servant Job? And God is testifying how great Job is. So it's clear that we as readers know that, but none of the other characters do, which sets up this amazing tension as they're talking it over. We know the backstory and they don't, and they don't. So Job says, I'm innocent. And you were like, as readers, we say, yeah, we know you are. The other guy's going to say, how dare you say you're innocent? And so, and then of course, like we said a couple of times already, the tension isn't really resolved. So most writers will set up a great tension to resolve it. This just sets up that tension that carries it all the way through. It's really magnificent. It's I'm kind of reading and seeing it as I read more commentaries on it, seeing it at a whole new light.
Is there a Bible? Is there a Bible difficulty here? Just the whole idea that God kind of like uses Job as a, I don't know. I mean, the idea that God just uses him for this big test.
Yeah. There are a number of Bible difficulties like that. And I think you could spend a lot of time just in the first two chapters talking about that, right? It's like God and Satan making a bet. like it sounds like the movie Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. Like it sounds like these, they're just toying with Job's life. And wait, part of the bet, all his kids get wiped out too. All those lives are lost. That's just part of God's. It seems so callous and cold. The modern reader could just stop in their tracks right there and say, this is not a God I want to know at all. I mean, it's just lots of questions like that. Controversies raised by this. And you kind of got to, if you want to get to the meat of it, get beyond some of that stuff. I do have something I wanted to bounce off you guys. I was thinking I was doing this when I got to teach on this. I have a little Bernedoodle dog. It's a miniature Bernedoodle. And it's really cute, real fluffy. And my dog loves me to death. And I was thinking of embedding a video into the talk because my dog loves me. And I know my dog loves me because every time I'm getting a snack at night, my dog will just stand there and look at me and stare at me. And I'll look at my kids and I say, have you seen my dog? And his name is Obi. Have you seen my dog, Obi? Behold, my dog loves me. Look how my dog Obi loves me, and he loves me for me. And I always tell the same joke, and my kids don't think it's funny anymore. But I say, my dog loves me for me. And they say, no, take away his snack and he will curse you to your face. And it's exactly the setup for the book of Job, where Satan is saying, God says, Job is wonderful. Look how wonderful he is. He loves me. And Satan says, come on. He doesn't love you. He loves your stuff. You treat him so well. Of course he loves you. That's the bet. But I do think little controversies like that, you got to get beyond.
And one of the questions is, God initiates. One of the questions that I would think, as studying the book of Job, you have to process, well, what's behind this? God initiates this encounter. The scripture says that God doesn't tempt anyone, and he himself is not tempted by evil. And yet here God initiates this challenge, if you will, between himself and Satan.
Right.
Kind of like the same tension you have where it says Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness in the Gospels, that Satan is the tempter in the wilderness, but yet Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness.
Yes.
So kind of that tension of God presenting this whole encounter.
There's a theme there on the accuser. Don't remind me. We'll come back to that. But this notion of God and Satan having this really kind of casual conversation, and this is another Bible difficulty that was noted. Like they're just talking, and God is very almost like casual familiarity with Satan. Where you come from? Oh, we're roaming about the earth. Have you seen my servant Job? There's like this friendly, casual conversation. One of the questions is, does that still happen today? Does Satan and God talk about us as individuals that way? And then the controversy of where does the evil come from? And you were starting to go there, Jim. Like, is God the author of the evil? Does he, all these awful things that come in, is God the source of that? And so one of the commentators I was quickly squashed that, said, no, God is not the author of that, but God allows it. He's always in control, but it's Satan doing the one of taking the kids away, and Satan is taking the wealth away. Satan's the sores and all the bad things that happen to Job. It's always Satan, the author of the bad things. Of course, that raises a question now, if bad things happen to me today, is that Satan doing it? I got a flat tire. Is that Satan doing that? Or is that just, I got a flat tire? It's where I drove over the nail. It's where the world works, right? Anyway, lots of little rabbit holes.
And even with his children, there's different ways in which the calamity comes to them.
How's that?
Because some of the children are attacked by the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans, and then other ones die because there was a wind that came and blew the shelter over onto them. So
natural disaster.
So even in that, you have man-made calamity or man-caused calamity, and then you have the idea of natural calamity.
Right. So in the man-caused calamity, Satan is clearly doing this. We know that Satan is behind this, but the Chaldeans are attacking. So then Satan must have caused this other army troop to initiate the attack on the kids. Anyway, lots of questions like that. You could spend all kinds of time. I think if you do that, you'll get away from the big picture themes of the book of Job, which are suffering. And the other big theme, I knew it was all about suffering, Greg, but the other big thing as I was reading about it is this big philosophical question of how does the world really work? And that's why I think it's in wisdom literature, is because I think that most of the talks I've heard about Job, most of the lessons I heard about Job are all about suffering, how to deal with suffering. When you ask, why am I suffering? But when you read through all the dialogues, which I'm on the hook for in a couple of weeks, so much of it is this core question of how exactly does the world work? The guy from the Bible Project, I listened to his lecture. He had a great breakout, but he is quoting somebody else. I think he was quoting one of his seminary professors. So we all have different sources. But he said, you think about it this way, there are 3 different principles in the book. And this is a way to diagram and think about it. He drew it as a triangle. Maybe I'll put it on the screen as a triangle, Greg, or just list them. But the one is God's justice. The other is Job's innocence. And the third is the retribution principle. And that third one, the retribution principle, is the idea that it's good things are supposed to happen to good people and bad things are supposed to happen to bad people. And everyone believes that, and no matter what your faith is, everyone believes that. If you're a secular humanist and you see someone who's in jail because they were wrongly accused of this murder, and then 40 years later, the DNA proves them innocent, you say, oh, it's a tragedy. They lost their life. They're wrongly accused. And everyone thinks that's wrong. Even if you're totally secular, no one says, well, what difference does life make anyway? So he lost 40 years. Who cares? Life is meaningless. It's pointless. It grates on everybody to hear that, injustice, because it's not supposed to work that way. He was innocent and he suffered. It's wrong. It's wrong. And everyone has that moral sense, because we live in whether or not you agree to, you're religious or not, everyone lives and it feels like they're in a moral universe. Yeah. And so these guys wrestle with this, and I don't know if that's the right words for it. Maybe Jim or Greg, there's maybe a better theological term. Like he called it the retribution principle, which is supposed to be good things for good people, bad things for bad people. And it's that, Job's innocence and God's justice, those 3 themes, and those 3 are irreconcilable in the book. And that is the whole tension of the narrative, because those 3 things cannot all be true at the same time. You can't have the retribution principle working perfectly, Job being perfectly innocent, and God being perfectly just. And all the characters in the book solve that riddle by ditching one or two of the other. They'll hang on to one of those and drop the others. Job will say, I know I'm innocent, and I'm not letting go of that. I am innocent. That's rock bad. And God is just. And so at first he says, okay, and God is just, and I'm going to accept it all. But then the retribution principle can't be right. He starts abandoning it. And there's this fascinating progression in the course of the book where Job at first is saying, oh, I could never question God. He's so holy and just. And then later, midway through, he's like, if I had a chance, I would talk to him about this. It's like in chapter 13. And when the dialogues, he starts saying, yeah, if I would. And then later he says, no, I couldn't. I couldn't. But I would, but he's so strong, I couldn't. But towards the end, he's like, I want my case. I have a case with him. I want my day in court, and I would win. I would win because I'm right. So at the end, he holds on to his own innocence, and he starts to question God's justice, and he definitely questions the retribution principle, but he wavers back and forth on those. The other guys, of course, never let go of the retribution principle, never let go of God's justice, and they completely torch Job's innocence, right? And there's like, you must have done something. And when he says, no, I haven't, like that angers him even more, right? There you go, proclaiming innocence. How he can't believe you're even doing this. And they start, I don't know if you remember this, they start taunting each other. They're actually, the opening chapters of all their poems are almost nasty with each other. Oh, you think you've got wisdom? I've got wisdom too. That kind of stuff. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.